The dead woman spoke on Hannah Mercer's first night in the Wycliffe house. The voice came through the wall just after 11, thin and trembling beneath the hiss of a phonograph cylinder. Hannah had been unpacking her 2 plain dresses when she heard a woman say Ruth's name. Then came 6 words that made her put down the hairbrush in her hand. "I did not choose to leave." The machine gave a dry scrape. A child gasped. Something struck the floor and broke. By the time Hannah reached the dark parlor, 11-year-old Matthew Bell was on his knees beside the phonograph, gathering brown splinters of wax with bleeding fingers. His grandmother stood over him in her mourning silk, one hand clenched around her ebony cane. Cornelia Wycliffe could barely see the boy, but she knew exactly what he had played. She ordered Hannah to forget the voice, forget the name, and remember what she had been hired to do. Hannah would remember that command for the rest of her life. She would also remember Matthew looking up from the broken cylinder and asking, through the stammer that seized him whenever he was frightened, why a dead mother would need to say she had not left. No one answered him. Hannah had arrived in Cincinnati that afternoon beneath a sky the color of old pewter. It was November of 1904, and the smoke of the river factories lay low over the city. From the streetcar window she had seen chimneys, church towers, steep streets, and rows of brick houses climbing the hills above the Ohio. Everything looked as if it had been rubbed with coal dust. The Wycliffe house stood on Mount Auburn behind an iron fence. It was not one of the new stone palaces that had begun appearing farther north. It was older and sterner, built of dark red brick with narrow windows and black walnut doors. A fan of bare branches covered the front like the ribs of an enormous hand. Hannah had expected a servant to answer. Instead, a thin girl of 16 opened the door and examined her as if she were an object delivered in error. The girl wore a high-necked gray dress, too sober for her youth. Her dark hair was pinned so tightly that it pulled the skin at her temples. She asked if Hannah was the new reader. Hannah said that she was Mrs. Mercer. The girl glanced at the modest valise on the step and replied that all paid companions were called by their surnames in that house. She did not offer her own name. She merely turned and told Hannah to follow. That was Hannah's first meeting with Ruth Bell. The girl led her through a central hall where no clock ticked. Dustless tables stood beneath gas sconces. Paintings in heavy frames watched from the walls, but several pale rectangles showed where pictures had been removed. In the front parlor, a mahogany phonograph sat beneath a linen cover. Its brass horn had been turned toward the wall. Hannah noticed it because she had spent 6 years demonstrating talking machines in a music shop on 4th Street. She knew the smell of wax cylinders, machine oil, and warm metal as other women knew lavender water or bread in an oven. The shop had closed when its owner died, and respectable employment had proved scarce for a widow of 38, whose chief qualifications were a steady reading voice and an ability to coax shy customers toward expensive machines. The position at the Wycliffe house had sounded almost merciful. An elderly widow with failing sight required a live-in reader and companion. The hours were fixed, the wages were generous. There would be no shop window, no men asking Hannah to demonstrate love songs twice merely to watch her bend over the machine, and no anxious calculation at the end of each week over rent. The housekeeper, Mrs. Doyle, met them at the stairs. She had a broad Irish face and capable red hands. Her kindness showed only for a moment, in the way she took Hannah's valise before Ruth could tell her where to put it. Mrs. Doyle explained the household quietly as they climbed. Mrs. Cornelia Wycliffe was 68 and nearly blind from cataracts. Her late husband had founded a machine tool works along the canal. Their only surviving child, Lydia, had married Jonathan Bell, a draftsman at the works. Lydia was dead. Jonathan and the 2 children still lived beneath Cornelia's roof. Mrs. Doyle paused outside Hannah's 3rd-floor room before adding that the family did not discuss Mrs. Bell. Hannah had heard rules like that before. Families often built silence around the dead and called it dignity. She had done something similar after her husband Samuel was buried. For almost a year she had not spoken his name because saying it seemed to open a door in her chest that she could not close. But Samuel's photograph had remained on her washstand. No pale rectangle marked his removal from her life. Cornelia received Hannah at 4 o'clock in the library. She sat upright in a carved chair beside the fire, dressed in black silk with a jet brooch at her throat. Her hair was white, her shoulders narrow, and her face still handsome in a severe way. Clouded eyes fixed on a point slightly to Hannah's left. On the table beside her lay the afternoon newspaper, a silver bell, a bottle of eye drops, and a stack of letters tied with green ribbon. Cornelia did not waste time on welcome. She asked Hannah to read a column about a dispute at the street railway company. After 3 sentences, she stopped her. Hannah was too fast. After another 3, she was too expressive. News was not theater, Cornelia said. A hired reader existed to make print audible, not to place herself between the words and the listener. Hannah began again. This time, Cornelia allowed her to finish. The terms of the position followed. Hannah would read from 9 until noon, again from 2 until 4, and for 1 hour after supper. She would answer correspondence when dictated, accompany Cornelia on calls, and keep her own opinions, unless asked for them. She was not a governess to the children, not a secretary to Jonathan Bell, and not a member of the family. At the last sentence, Cornelia's pale eyes found her exactly. Hannah understood that the words had been polished by repetition. She said the arrangement was clear. Only then did Cornelia ask whether Hannah knew how to operate a phonograph. Hannah looked toward the library door through which the covered machine in the parlor was just visible. She said she did. Cornelia's fingers tightened on the head of her cane. The machines were not to be used, not by Hannah, not by the children, not by anyone. There had been a time, she added, when foolish people believed a voice preserved in wax could defeat death. It could not. It merely taught the living to listen backward. Hannah thought the phrase too wounded to have been invented for a new employee, but she gave the required answer. She would not touch the machine. At supper, she sat with Mrs. Doyle and a maid named Elsie in the basement room. The family ate above them. Hannah heard almost nothing through the ceiling. No laughter, no chair scraping suddenly back, no child asking for anything. Mrs. Doyle poured tea and told Hannah that silence was valued at Wycliffe House. The maid looked down at her plate. Hannah asked how long Lydia Bell had been dead. Mrs. Doyle said it had been 2 years since the telegram came from Colorado. Then she changed the subject. That night, when the dead woman's voice passed through the wall, Hannah learned that silence was not valued in the house. It was enforced. Cornelia did not strike Matthew after the cylinder broke. Her cruelty was colder and more exact. She ordered him to place every fragment on a handkerchief and carry it to the library. When he cut his thumb, she rang for Mrs. Doyle instead of touching him. Ruth appeared at the top of the stairs in a white nightdress, but Jonathan did not come at all. Under the gaslight, Matthew's face looked younger than 11. He had his mother's dark eyes, though Hannah did not yet know that. He kept trying to explain where he had found the cylinder. Each attempt caught on the first sound. Cornelia waited without helping him. Finally, Hannah said the boy seemed to have discovered it behind a drawer in the cabinet. Cornelia turned her blind gaze toward Hannah and asked whether she had already forgotten the limits of her position. Hannah apologized. Matthew carried the pieces away. As he passed, one curved sliver fell soundlessly onto the dark carpet. Hannah placed her shoe over it. She did not decide to conceal it. The movement happened before decision, as if her body had answered something her mind had not yet understood. Later, alone in her room, she removed the sliver from her pocket. 3 letters had been scratched into the outer surface in a woman's hand. R-U-T. The rest had broken away. Hannah wrapped the wax in a square of linen and placed it at the bottom of her sewing case. She told herself she meant only to keep Matthew from being punished again. She did not believe herself. At breakfast the next morning, no one mentioned the voice. Cornelia dictated a note to the minister concerning flowers for an invalid. She chose white chrysanthemums and instructed that the card include no sentimental verse. Then Hannah read aloud from the Commercial Tribune until her throat became dry. At 11, Matthew appeared in the doorway with a schoolbook pressed against his coat. His thumb had been bandaged. He asked his grandmother whether he might walk home for luncheon instead of eating at school. The request took him nearly a minute. Cornelia told him that a boy who refused to master his own tongue would never master anything else. He was to speak again without stopping. Matthew tried. The first word trapped him. A flush rose from his collar to his forehead. Hannah kept her eyes on the newspaper. Cornelia made him begin a third time. Ruth crossed the hall behind him, pulling on her gloves. She did not look at her brother. Jonathan's footsteps sounded on the stairs and then retreated as if he had heard enough to know that entering would require courage. Matthew finally forced out the request. His grandmother refused it. When the front door closed behind him, Cornelia asked Hannah to continue the article. Hannah read 3 lines before stopping. She said that the print had blurred. Cornelia gave a small, humorless smile. It was an interesting complaint from a woman hired to serve the blind. Hannah began again. For the rest of the morning, every word tasted of shame. After luncheon, Mrs. Doyle found Hannah beside the kitchen range, holding a cup of coffee she had forgotten to drink. The housekeeper said that Matthew's stammer had begun when his mother went west. Before that, he had talked from waking until sleep. Lydia used to say the boy had been born with too many words and too little time. Hannah asked why Lydia had gone to Colorado. Mrs. Doyle's expression closed. She had been ill. Hannah asked whether it was consumption. Mrs. Doyle crossed herself, although she was Protestant, and said that some illnesses made prisoners not only of bodies but of whole families. Then she carried a tray upstairs. That afternoon, Cornelia chose a volume of sermons. Hannah read about obedience, vanity, and the danger of confusing earthly affection with moral duty. Near 3, the library door opened a few inches. Matthew stood in the gap. He did not enter. He only looked at Hannah and touched his bandaged thumb. She knew what he was asking. She also knew that answering him could cost her the best position she had held since Samuel died. Hannah turned a page and continued reading. The door closed. Her wages already felt like money earned by cowardice. For the first 2 weeks, Hannah saw the family mostly in passing. Jonathan Bell left the house before 8 each morning and returned after dark. He was a tall man of 44 with iron-gray hair and a careful stoop, as though years spent above drafting tables had taught his body to apologize for its height. At the works, he supervised the design room, yet in Cornelia's house, he moved with the caution of a poor relation. He thanked Hannah when she handed him a misdirected letter. His voice was courteous, but far away. Ruth spent her mornings at a private girls' academy and her afternoons preparing for a winter season of calls, concerts, and church obligations. Cornelia had chosen every family the girl was permitted to visit. She had also chosen the pale dresses that made Ruth look like a photograph of a dutiful daughter. Matthew attended the neighborhood school and came home by the rear entrance, where he could avoid his grandmother's library. On a wet Thursday, Hannah found him on the back stairs with a volume of Longfellow open on his knees. He was trying to read The Village Blacksmith aloud. At each difficult sound, he struck the page with one finger as if punishing the word. Hannah sat 2 steps below him. She told him that a phonograph did not shame a singer when a note cracked. It simply turned and waited for the next sound. Matthew said his grandmother was not a phonograph. The sentence came easily because anger carried it. Hannah agreed. She showed him how to mark a breath between phrases. She asked him to hum the line before speaking it. Samuel had done the same thing after a fever damaged his hearing and left him uncertain of his own voice. The trick had not cured anything. It had only given fear less room. Matthew tried. The first line emerged slowly. The second came with one hard stop. By the fourth, the rhythm was carrying him. When he finished the stanza, he looked astonished. Hannah warned him that tomorrow might be difficult again. He said he knew. Then after a pause, he asked whether she had heard enough of the cylinder to recognize his mother's voice. Hannah could have lied. Instead, she said she had heard only one sentence. Matthew's face tightened. He remembered Lydia's voice only in pieces. Sometimes he could hear her calling him from the garden. Sometimes he could hear her singing while pinning up her hair. But whenever he tried to hold the sound, it changed into his grandmother's voice telling him not to dwell. He had found the cylinder while looking for a chess piece dropped behind the parlor cabinet. He did not know who had hidden it. There had been other empty spaces in the wooden rack. Hannah asked whether Lydia had made many recordings. Matthew nodded. His mother had loved the machine from the day Jonathan brought it home from Chicago. She recorded nursery rhymes, birthday greetings, piano music, and ordinary messages when people were away. Cornelia disliked the habit. She said family affection should not be performed into a horn like an act at a fair. After Lydia left, the cylinders disappeared. Hannah did not tell him about the fragment in her sewing case. It was not yet kindness to give a grieving child part of a word. It might only teach him to bleed on sharper edges. Footsteps approached from the hall. Ruth stood at the foot of the stairs holding a folded parasol. She asked Matthew whether he intended to become a public reciter. He closed the book. Hannah said they had been practicing for school. Ruth's expression settled on her. There was fear beneath the girl's contempt. Hannah saw it clearly now. Ruth told her that employees who made themselves necessary often mistook dependence for affection. Her grandmother had dismissed the last companion for that error. Hannah asked if the warning came from Cornelia. Ruth said it came from experience. Then she walked upstairs, each step measured and silent. Matthew watched her go. He said Ruth had once imitated every person in the house and made their mother laugh until she cried. Now she spoke exactly like their grandmother. Hannah thought that children sometimes borrowed the voice that frightened them most. It was a way of pretending the fear belonged to someone else. She did not say it aloud. Cornelia's callers arrived every Tuesday. They came in polished carriages and left damp calling cards on a silver tray. They were widows of manufacturers, wives of judges, officers of church societies, and women whose husbands' names had been printed in Cincinnati newspapers for 3 generations. Their dresses whispered across the parlor carpet. Their voices did not. Hannah's duty was to read notices from the Women's Civic Improvement League while the ladies drank tea. On her 3rd Tuesday, she stood beside the mantel and read a report on tenement sanitation. Mrs. Devereaux, a soft woman with sharp eyes, praised the League's concern for factory families. She then complained that her newest maid expected an evening off each week. The others laughed. Ruth sat beside her grandmother in a cream dress. She held a teacup without drinking and watched every gesture around her, memorizing the rules of a life being chosen on her behalf. Philip Gage's mother was among the callers. Mrs. Gage had brought her son once, on the excuse of collecting a subscription for a hospital fund. He was 25, well-dressed, and likely to inherit an interest in his father's bank. Cornelia had become almost warm in his presence. Hannah understood what was forming before Ruth did. The girl would be 17 in January. The Gages had money, a clean name, and ambitions in the city. The Wycliffe Machine Works had survived a difficult decade but needed favorable credit. A marriage could make old respectability and new necessity look like romance. During the reading, Mrs. Gage interrupted to ask Hannah where she had been educated. Hannah said she had attended the public high school until her mother became ill. Mrs. Gage seemed surprised by her pronunciation. Before Hannah could answer, Cornelia explained that Mrs. Mercer had worked in a shop where clear speech was useful for selling machines. She possessed a serviceable voice, though no formal cultivation. The women looked at Hannah with fresh interest. One asked whether she had recorded comic songs for gentlemen. Another wondered if shop demonstrators were expected to sing into the horn. Hannah said she had demonstrated the instruments, not herself. Cornelia tapped her cane. The reading was to continue. Hannah continued. When the report ended, Mrs. Devereux asked her to pour more tea. There were no empty chairs. Hannah stood between the women, refilling cups while they discussed a proposed reading room for working girls. Cornelia declared that suitable books could improve a woman whose home had failed to provide standards. Hannah set the pot down. She said a chair might also improve her. The room went still. It was not a clever remark. Hannah regretted it before the last word left her mouth. But she had been standing for almost 2 hours, and Samuel used to say that fatigue loosened truth from places good sense kept tied. Mrs. Devereux's lips twitched. Cornelia's face did not change. She told Ruth to bring the small chair from the writing desk. For one foolish second, Hannah believed she had been heard. Ruth lifted the chair, carried it past Hannah, and placed it beneath Mrs. Gage's feet. The women resumed their conversation. Heat moved up Hannah's throat. She had known humiliations sharper than this. She had been dismissed by a customer as a shop ornament. She had heard a landlord suggest that a widow might settle rent in ways not written on a receipt. Yet the quiet precision of Ruth's act wounded her more than open insult. Ruth did not look proud afterward. She looked obedient. That made it worse. When the callers had gone, Cornelia remained in the parlor. She told Hannah that wit was a luxury paid companions could not afford. Hannah replied that dignity cost nothing. Cornelia said dignity without position was merely pride. Hannah gathered the newspapers. She wanted to say that blindness of the eyes was not the most dangerous kind in that house. The words rose and stopped behind her teeth. Cornelia seemed to hear them anyway. She asked whether Hannah wished to give notice. Hannah thought of her rented room above a cobbler's shop already surrendered. She thought of the dwindling money in the bank. She thought of Matthew breathing between the lines of a poem. She said she did not. Cornelia nodded. The matter was finished. In the servants' room that evening, Ruth appeared while Hannah was mending a cuff. Mrs. Doyle and Elsie found reasons to leave. Ruth stood beside the table, pale and rigid. She said Hannah should not have made the remark before Mrs. Gage. Hannah asked whether that justified what Ruth had done. The girl said nothing. Hannah waited. At last, Ruth admitted that her grandmother had pressed 2 fingers against her wrist. It was a signal Cornelia used when she expected something. Ruth had moved the chair before she understood what she was doing. Hannah believed her. She also knew belief was not absolution. She said fear could explain cruelty, but the person humiliated still had to carry it home. Ruth looked around the small basement room. Perhaps for the first time she understood that Hannah's humiliation had nowhere else to go. She whispered that she was sorry. Hannah threaded her needle again. She told Ruth not to whisper apologies she had been bold enough to earn aloud. The girl's eyes flashed. For a moment, Hannah saw the child Matthew had described, quick and alive beneath the discipline. Then Ruth spoke clearly. "I am sorry, Mrs. Mercer." It was the first honest sentence Hannah heard from her. December brought a hard freeze to the city. The street gutters turned black with ice. Coal wagons labored up the hill. Frost flowered across the upper windows of Wycliffe House, and the pipes knocked at night like someone asking to be admitted. Cornelia's eyes worsened. Hannah began reading not only newspapers and sermons, but business letters from the works. Jonathan had objected at first. Cornelia reminded him that the enterprise still bore her name, and that his position there existed by her consent. He submitted. The letters revealed a company less secure than the house suggested. Orders had slowed. A new competitor in Dayton was undercutting prices. The bank had extended credit, but Mr. Gage expected assurances before spring. One morning, Cornelia dictated a note inviting Philip Gage to Ruth's birthday reception. She described the evening as small and familial. Then she added the names of 60 guests. Hannah wrote without comment. Cornelia asked whether her silence meant disapproval. Hannah said she had not been asked for an opinion. The old woman almost smiled. It was the nearest they had come to mutual respect. Later that day, a parcel arrived by post from Colorado Springs. It was a narrow wooden box wrapped in brown paper. The address was written in a careful, unfamiliar hand. Miss Ruth Lydia Bell, to be delivered on her 17th birthday in care of Mrs. Cornelia Wycliffe. The return name was Miss Celia Novak. Mrs. Doyle carried the parcel to the library. Hannah felt Cornelia change before the housekeeper finished reading the label. The widow's back straightened. Her hand found the silver bell and held it without ringing. She told Mrs. Doyle to leave them. When the door closed, Cornelia asked Hannah to open the box. Inside lay a cylinder case of faded blue leather. The velvet lining had worn thin at the edges. There was also a sealed letter, a small brass key, and a phonograph cylinder wrapped in cotton. On the lid of the cylinder box, in the same scratched hand Hannah had seen on the broken fragment, were the words, "For Ruth, when she is 17. Cornelia breathed once through her nose. She ordered Hannah to place the cylinder in the fire. Hannah did not move. The coal shifted behind the grate. Cornelia repeated the order. Hannah asked whether the voice belonged to Lydia. The old woman's cane struck the floor. Hannah picked up the cylinder. It was dark brown, slightly warped, and fragile from years of travel. Warmth from her palm could soften it. Heat from the fire would erase it in seconds. She carried it toward the grate. At the edge of the hearth, she stopped. Samuel had left no recording. The machines had existed while he was alive, but they were expensive, and Hannah had always believed there would be time. After his funeral, she had remembered every ordinary occasion when she might have captured his voice and had not. A Christmas greeting, a joke. The way he said her name when he knew she was angry. Memory preserved love poorly. It kept the final cough and misplaced the laughter. Hannah turned back. She said she would surrender the cylinder to Cornelia, but she would not burn it. Cornelia asked whether this was conscience or insubordination. Hannah said that sometimes they were the same thing. For several seconds, neither woman moved. Then Cornelia held out her hand. Hannah placed the cylinder in it. The blind widow's fingers closed around her daughter's voice. She did not crush it. Instead, she took the brass key, opened the bottom drawer of her desk, and locked the cylinder inside. The letter went with it, unread. Cornelia told Hannah that Lydia had been ill in ways the children could not understand. She had gone west for treatment and died there. Whatever she had recorded during that time belonged to sickness, confusion, and the past. Hannah asked why a message meant for Ruth's birthday had been sent now. Cornelia said Miss Novak was a woman who had mistaken nursing for intimacy. Then she instructed Hannah to forget the parcel. That evening, Ruth noticed the brown paper in the library wastebasket. She recognized her own name before Hannah could fold it away. The girl asked what had arrived. Hannah looked toward Cornelia, seated by the fire. Cornelia answered that it was an appeal from a Western charity using an old list. Ruth accepted the lie with the ease of long practice. Hannah felt complicit simply because she remained in the room. After supper, she found Jonathan in the front hall removing his wet overcoat. She told him a parcel had arrived from a Miss Celia Novak in Colorado Springs. She did not reveal the cylinder or the locked drawer. Some part of the truth still belonged to Ruth, and Hannah did not yet know whether Jonathan could be trusted with it. At the name, his hand stopped on the coat button. He asked whether Cornelia had seen the parcel. Hannah said she had. Jonathan closed his eyes. Then he told Hannah never to mention Miss Novak to the children. His quietness angered her more than Cornelia's command. She asked whether every adult in that house had promised to protect the children by lying to them. Jonathan looked toward the stairs. Ruth's music lesson sounded faintly from the floor above, each scale even and lifeless. He said Hannah had known the family for less than a month. She answered that Matthew had known them all his life, and he still had to search behind furniture for his mother's voice. Jonathan's face folded for an instant. It was not anger. It was pain so old that it had learned to make no sound. He said Lydia's lungs had begun bleeding in the spring of 1900. 2 physicians agreed she must leave the damp river air. Colorado offered a chance. The children were 12 and 6. Matthew had been delicate. They were told their mother was traveling to regain her strength. Hannah asked why Lydia had not returned. Jonathan said the disease advanced. Hannah asked why her recordings had been hidden. He stared at her. She understood then that he did not know. Before he could speak, Cornelia's bell rang from the library. Once, twice, a third time. Jonathan straightened, and the moment closed. He warned Hannah that Cornelia believed remembrance could be managed like a household account. Anyone who challenged that belief would be sent away. Hannah asked why he had stayed. He looked toward the ceiling where his children slept beneath Cornelia's roof. He said staying had once seemed like the same thing as keeping them safe. Then he went to answer the bell. The next morning, Matthew brought Hannah an empty wax cylinder. He had bought it for 12 cents from a second-hand dealer near the market. The coin had come from money saved for a sled. He wanted to make a recording for Ruth's birthday. Hannah reminded him that the phonograph was forbidden. Matthew said nearly everything worth saying in the house was forbidden. He had spoken the sentence without a single hesitation. They waited until Cornelia left for a church committee meeting and Jonathan was at the works. Mrs. Doyle agreed to keep Ruth in the sewing room on the pretext of measuring a hem. Hannah uncovered the parlor phonograph. Dust silvered the linen sheet. Beneath it, the machine's oak case was beautifully kept despite disuse. The recording attachment remained in a lower compartment. Lydia had labeled its small boxes in a rounded hand. Hannah wound the spring gently. The mechanism resisted, then began to turn with a low, familiar hum. Matthew stood before the recording horn with a sheet of paper. He had written 6 lines. He wanted to tell Ruth that he remembered when she had carried him through a thunderstorm and pretended the lightning was a photographer taking their picture. He wanted to thank her for staying near his room on nights when he could not speak. On his first attempt, no sound came. On the second, he became trapped on Ruth's name. He tore the paper. Hannah told him the machine did not require perfection. It required breath and truth. She placed the cylinder back at the beginning. Matthew closed his eyes. This time he spoke slowly. His stammer remained. The pauses were long, but he did not strike the words or begin again. When he finished, Hannah replayed the cylinder. Matthew heard his own uncertain voice emerge from the brass horn. At first he looked horrified. Then the recorded boy reached the final line without abandoning it. Ruth, that boy said, had always heard what he meant, even when other people heard only the trouble he had saying it. Matthew covered his mouth. Hannah stopped the machine. He asked if that was truly how he sounded. She said it was how courage sounded before anyone polished it. They placed the cylinder in the blue case's empty outer compartment. Matthew planned to give it to Ruth in private. Neither of them noticed that the front carriage had returned early. Cornelia stood in the parlor doorway. Mrs. Doyle was behind her, white-faced. Ruth hovered farther down the hall. The old widow did not shout. She crossed the room by counting the carpet's raised borders beneath her cane. Her hand found the phonograph horn. From there, she traced the machine to the recording attachment. She asked who had uncovered it. Matthew tried to answer. Hannah said she had. Cornelia asked who had wound it. Hannah gave the same answer. Matthew forced out that the idea was his. Cornelia told him to be silent. Hannah stepped between them before remembering how useless such a gesture was against a woman who punished through dependence. Cornelia turned toward Ruth. She asked whether the girl now saw what happened when servants were permitted to confuse a child's weakness with a claim on the family. Ruth held the newly recorded cylinder. Mrs. Doyle must have given it to her before Cornelia entered. Her fingers were trembling. Matthew said it was a birthday gift. Ruth looked at him. For 1 second, the hard training left her face. Then Cornelia asked whether Ruth intended to reward disobedience. The girl placed the cylinder on the table. She told Matthew that she had no wish to hear him make a spectacle of his defect. The words struck more brutally because Hannah knew they were not Ruth's. Matthew did not cry. He simply seemed to disappear while still standing in the room. Hannah said the cruelty belonged to Ruth now, regardless of who had taught it to her. Cornelia ordered Hannah upstairs to pack. Jonathan would settle her wages at the end of the day. Hannah packed before noon. She folded the 2 dresses, the black wool skirt, Samuel's photograph, and the sewing case containing the wax fragment. Everything she owned still fit inside one valise. The fact had once made her feel free. That morning, it made her feel as though no place had ever expected her to remain. Mrs. Doyle brought bread and cheese to the room. She apologized without defending Cornelia. That was one of the housekeeper's better qualities. She had served the Wycliffes for 21 years and knew the difference between loyalty and lying, even if fear sometimes made her practice both. She said Matthew had locked himself in the old schoolroom. Ruth was in her bedroom. Cornelia had ordered the phonograph removed to the attic before nightfall. Hannah asked whether the cylinder from Colorado was still in the desk. Mrs. Doyle looked toward the open door. Then she nodded. She had been present when the first cylinders arrived from the west, 3 months after Lydia left. Cornelia had stored them in the same drawer. More came. Mrs. Doyle did not know how many. One winter, she saw 2 wooden cases carried to the furnace room. Afterward, the ash smelled strangely sweet. Hannah sat down on the bed. Wax. Mrs. Doyle's eyes filled. She said she had told herself the cylinders might have contained only coughing or confused talk. Mrs. Wycliffe had said listening would disturb the children. Mr. Bell had stopped asking questions. Everyone in the house learned to call inaction obedience. Hannah asked why the blue case had survived. Mrs. Doyle thought it had never been delivered before. The handwriting belonged to Lydia's nurse, not Lydia. Perhaps that was why it reached the front door instead of the furnace. Hannah took the wax fragment from her sewing case and placed it in Mrs. Doyle's palm. She asked the housekeeper to give it to Matthew when he was older, or sooner, if the truth became safe. Mrs. Doyle closed Hannah's fingers around it again. Truth did not become safe by waiting, she said. It only became late. Hannah returned the fragment to its linen wrapping. At 1 o'clock, Jonathan came home from the works. He found her in the hall wearing her coat. Snow had begun to powder the front steps. Cornelia remained in the library with the doors shut. Jonathan offered 4 weeks' wages in an envelope, though Hannah had worked less than 1. She took only the amount owed. He said he was sorry. Hannah asked which part he regretted. His mother-in-law's behavior, he said, Matthew's distress, the position in which Hannah had been placed. He named every sorrow except his own choice. Hannah handed back the rest of the money. She told him that apology was not a room where a person could sit while someone else repaired the damage. He flinched. The schoolroom door opened above them. Matthew came down carrying the cylinder he had made for Ruth. His grandmother had not destroyed it. Perhaps its unsteady grooves had seemed unworthy of the effort. He held it toward Hannah. He could not make the words come, but she understood that he wanted her to keep it. Hannah refused. The recording belonged to Ruth. He shook his head. She crouched until they were level. She said Ruth had failed him that morning, but one failure was not the whole of a person. He must leave her a road back. Matthew stared at the cylinder. Then he slipped it into his coat pocket. Ruth stood at the upper landing. Her face was colorless. Hannah waited for her to speak. The girl said nothing. Cornelia's bell rang. Jonathan turned his head toward the library from habit. That small movement decided something in Hannah. She lifted her valises, opened the front door, and walked into the snow before anyone could ask her to forgive what they had not yet found the courage to stop. The room Hannah rented stood above Mrs. Rosen's millinery shop on Vine Street. It was narrow and smelled of steam, felt, and boiled cabbage from the restaurant next door. A single window looked across rooftops toward a painted advertisement for liver pills. At night, the electric signs downtown brightened the low clouds, but her room was lit by gas that hissed whenever the wind pressed against the glass. Mrs. Rosen had a large family, a loud temper, and a practical dislike of despair. She gave Hannah 2 days to be miserable. On the third, she sent her downstairs to help trim mourning hats. Hannah sewed black ribbon while customers spoke of Christmas. The work paid little, but it occupied her hands. Matthew's voice remained with her. So did Lydia's 6 words. Sometimes she wondered whether she had heard them accurately. The machine had hissed, the cylinder had been damaged. Memory might have arranged the sentence according to her own anger. At other times, she touched the fragment in her sewing case and knew that doubt was simply Cornelia's silence continuing its work from a distance. 4 days after Hannah left the house, Jonathan came to the millinery shop. He looked out of place among the velvet forms and artificial violets. Mrs. Rosen recognized expensive grief when she saw it. She sent Hannah upstairs without being asked and told Jonathan he had 10 minutes before she charged him for the use of the stair. In Hannah's room, he remained standing. He had brought the rest of her wages. She refused them again. Then he offered to restore her position. Cornelia, he said, had agreed that Hannah might return if she acknowledged the phonograph episode as an error and promised no further involvement with the children. Hannah almost laughed. She asked whether Cornelia imagined a paid companion was so hungry for shelter that she would return to the same locked room and thank the key. Jonathan said winter limited everyone's choices. Hannah replied that dependence had limited his for 4 years. She was trying not to learn from him. The words were cruel. She saw that as soon as they landed. Jonathan moved to the window. Snow melt streaked the glass. For a long moment he studied the rooftops. Then he told her what happened when Lydia left. She had begun coughing after Matthew's 6th birthday. By May there was blood on her handkerchief. The physician insisted on separation from the children, especially Matthew, whose lungs had always been weak. Cornelia arranged a place at a private sanatorium outside Colorado Springs and paid every expense. Lydia did not want to go. She begged to remain in Cincinnati, even if she had to live in a rented room and see the children only through a garden fence. Jonathan believed the western air might save her. Cornelia believed fear made Lydia selfish. Together they persuaded her. At the station, Lydia made Cornelia promise that Ruth and Matthew would receive a letter every week. She also asked that the phonograph be sent after her. Jonathan packed it himself. For the first months, letters came frequently. Cornelia read selected portions to the children. Lydia wrote that the mountains were bright, that she was gaining strength, that she would return. Then Ruth began having nightmares. Matthew cried whenever the post arrived. Cornelia said the letters were keeping the wound open. A physician, not the one who treated Lydia, but a family acquaintance, agreed that the children required calm. Jonathan allowed Cornelia to put the letters away. He wrote to Lydia that the children were adjusting and that frequent messages unsettled them. After that, Lydia's letters changed. They became less cheerful. Some were addressed directly to the children. Cornelia said they contained accusations and details of illness no child should read. Jonathan had not seen them. Hannah asked why. He said the works was failing then. A patent dispute had emptied their reserves. Cornelia held the mortgage on the factory and the deed to the house. Jonathan spent his days trying to protect the livelihood of 400 men and his evenings trying to calm 2 children. Whenever he questioned Cornelia, she reminded him that Lydia's treatment, his work, and his children's future all depended on her. Hannah said dependency explained submission. It did not make submission harmless. Jonathan agreed. The quietness of that answer took the force from Hannah's anger. He said there had been one telephone call from Colorado near the end. The connection was poor. A nurse told him Lydia wanted to hear the children. Cornelia refused to wake them. She said Lydia was fevered and the sound would haunt them. Jonathan had taken the receiver. He heard Lydia breathing. He heard her say Ruth's name. Then the line failed. The death telegram arrived 2 days later. Hannah watched his reflection in the dark window. He had spent 4 years appearing empty because the alternative was to admit that he had helped another person erase his wife while she was still alive. He asked whether Hannah could understand why he had stayed. She said she understood fear. She understood poverty. She understood how a decision made for one day hardened into a life. What she did not understand was why, after hearing his daughter's voice from behind a locked door, he was still asking a stranger to return and behave. Jonathan turned. Hannah told him about the birthday cylinder in Cornelia's desk. His face changed. He asked whether it had been played. Hannah said no. He moved toward the door, then stopped. Years of obedience visibly caught him even there, in a room Cornelia had never entered. Hannah opened the door for him. She said his wife had already waited 4 years for him to cross a hallway. Jonathan left without taking the wages. He did not cross it. Hannah learned that a week later when Ruth came to the millinery shop. The girl wore a dark blue coat and no chaperone. Snow clung to the hem. Mrs. Rosen took one look at her and sent them upstairs, but not before making Ruth pay for a hat pin she had brushed from the counter. In Hannah's room, Ruth stood beside the cold stove. She said her father had been different since visiting. He had entered Cornelia's library twice and come out without mentioning what was discussed. The desk drawer remained locked. Hannah asked whether Ruth knew what was inside. Ruth said only that the parcel had not come from a charity. She had found a piece of the wrapping in the wastebasket with the Colorado postmark. Her voice remained composed until she asked whether the sender had known her mother. Hannah said yes. Ruth gripped the back of a chair. She wanted to know whether the parcel contained a letter. Hannah told her it contained something intended for her 17th birthday. Ruth turned toward the window. Her face appeared beside the painted advertisement across the street, a pale reflection suspended above a smiling yellow bottle. She said her birthday reception would take place in 8 days. Philip Gage was expected to make an announcement. Hannah asked whether Ruth loved him. The girl answered that he was kind. Hannah had heard women use that word when they meant a man had not yet injured them in a way other people could see. She asked again. Ruth said love was not the only consideration in marriage. Her grandmother had explained the condition of the works. The Gage Bank could protect her father's position and Matthew's future. At 16, she had already learned to disguise surrender as responsibility. Hannah asked what Philip thought of Matthew. Ruth said he believed firm treatment would correct the stammer. Hannah felt a chill that did not come from the room. Ruth hurried to add that Philip admired decisive people. He disliked scenes, weakness, and excessive attachment to the past. Hannah said he sounded very much like Cornelia. The girl's mouth tightened. She had not come to discuss Philip. She had come to ask whether Matthew's cylinder still existed. Hannah said Matthew had kept it. Ruth looked relieved and wounded at once. She admitted that she had stood outside his door after Hannah left. She wanted to apologize. Each time she raised her hand, she heard her grandmother's voice telling her that pity fed weakness. Hannah said the hand belonged to Ruth. The girl lowered her eyes. Hannah then took the fragment from the sewing case. She unwrapped it on the table. Ruth recognized her mother's hand immediately. She touched the letters with one fingertip. Hannah repeated the sentence she had heard on her first night. Ruth's face emptied. She said it could have meant anything. Lydia might have been speaking of leaving Colorado, leaving a room, leaving some other person. A broken message was dangerous because grief completed it. The explanation was intelligent. It was also Cornelia's. Hannah did not argue. She folded the linen and offered the fragment. Ruth stepped back. She said she did not want it. Then, at the door, she asked Hannah not to attend the birthday reception if anyone invited her. Hannah said no one would. Ruth replied that Matthew might. The girl left the fragment behind. That night, Hannah lay awake listening to the sounds of Mrs. Rosen's family below. 2 daughters quarreled over a comb, a baby woke. Mr. Rosen came home late and dropped his boots in the hall. Someone laughed when he cursed. The noise was untidy and alive. Hannah wondered when Ruth had first mistaken quiet for safety. On the morning before Ruth's birthday, a woman arrived at the millinery shop carrying the blue leather cylinder case. She was perhaps 45, though travel and hard work had deepened the lines around her mouth. Her coat was good but old. A brown felt hat covered hair threaded with silver. She spoke with the softened consonants of someone born in Bohemia and educated in English by many different voices. She asked for Mrs. Hannah Mercer. Hannah had never seen her. The woman introduced herself as Celia Novak. Mrs. Rosen locked the shop door, turned the sign to closed, and brought coffee without asking for an explanation. Curiosity was one of her vices, but hospitality was stronger. Celia had come directly from Wycliffe House. Cornelia refused to receive her. Jonathan was at the works. Ruth and Matthew had been kept upstairs. Mrs. Doyle slipped Hannah's address into Celia's glove while escorting her out. The blue case on the table was not the one locked in Cornelia's desk. It matched it. Celia opened the lid. 6 cylinders lay in velvet slots. Each was wrapped in cotton and labeled with a date. June 1900, Christmas 1900, Matthew's 7th birthday, Ruth's 14th birthday, spring 1901, for Jonathan. Hannah sat down. Celia had nursed Lydia at the sanatorium for nearly 2 years. She had not been Lydia's closest friend at first. She was simply the night nurse, willing to operate the recording machine when Lydia was too weak to wind it. Lydia spoke into wax because writing exhausted her and coughing stained the paper. She recorded ordinary things, memories of the children, a story Matthew liked, advice Ruth would roll her eyes at and remember later, messages to Jonathan she was ashamed to write. The first case was mailed to Cincinnati in July 1900. It came back unopened. Cornelia had written across the wrapper that Mrs. Bell's family required peace and that further packages would be destroyed. Celia showed them the wrapper. She had kept it folded beneath the lining. The black ink had faded. The intention had not. Lydia continued recording. She believed Jonathan would eventually ask. When he did not, she began to suspect that he had chosen silence. Near the end, Celia offered to contact him without Cornelia's knowledge. Lydia refused. She would not make the children witnesses to a war between adults. Instead, she recorded one final cylinder for Ruth's 17th birthday. She chose the age because 17 had been the last year of her own life before Cornelia began arranging it. Lydia asked Celia to deliver the cylinder if she received no request from the family before then. The first blue case had been sent ahead. Celia planned to follow in person. Hannah asked why she had waited until the final day. Celia's hands closed around her coffee cup. She had been afraid. After Lydia died, Cornelia's attorney wrote warning that any attempt to disturb the children would be treated as harassment. Celia was an immigrant nurse without money or family name. The sanatorium superintendent advised her to remain silent if she wanted references. She kept the cylinders through 3 moves, through a marriage that ended in widowhood, and through nights when she considered throwing them into a stove simply to end the promise. Then, 6 months earlier, Celia was diagnosed with a disease of the heart. The physician could not tell her whether she had 1 year or 10. Fear of Cornelia finally became smaller than fear of carrying Lydia's voice into another grave. Hannah looked at the 6 cylinders. She asked whether Celia had listened to them. "Only while recording," Celia said. "Never afterward. They belonged to the Bells." Hannah replied that belonging was exactly the question Cornelia had controlled all these years. Mrs. Rosen, who had been pretending to rearrange hat boxes, said the question was simpler. A mother had spoken to her children. The children should hear her. Hannah warned that walking into the reception with a box of voices could turn private grief into public theater. Celia agreed. She did not want spectacle. She wanted delivery. Hannah thought of Ruth's request that she stay away. She thought of Jonathan standing in her room, unable to cross a hallway. She thought of Matthew leaving his sister a road back. At last, she said they would go to the house that afternoon before the guests arrived. They would ask for Jonathan. If he refused, they would ask for Ruth. No cylinder would be played without the children's consent. Celia closed the case. Mrs. Rosen unlocked the shop and changed the sign. As Hannah buttoned her coat, Mrs. Rosen placed the most expensive black hat from the display on her head. Hannah protested. Mrs. Rosen said there were houses where truth would not be admitted unless it arrived properly dressed. Truth was not admitted that afternoon. Mrs. Doyle opened the rear door and let Hannah and Celia stand inside the service passage while snow melted from their boots. She sent Elsie to find Jonathan. He came from the dining room with a list of guests in his hand. At the sight of Celia, he stopped. She did not embrace him or accuse him. She gave her name and said she had brought the recordings Lydia asked her to deliver. Jonathan looked at the blue case. His hand rose, then fell. For a moment, Hannah believed he would take it. Cornelia's cane sounded in the hall. The old woman entered on Ruth's arm. She wore black velvet and a strand of pearls. Her clouded eyes were hidden behind smoked spectacles, but nothing about her seemed diminished. She told Celia that the attorney's warning remained in force. Celia said she had not come to disturb the children. Cornelia answered that she had crossed half a country carrying disturbance in a box. Ruth's fingers tightened beneath her grandmother's hand. Her gaze never left the blue case. Hannah said the recordings were Lydia's property, made for her husband and children. Cornelia turned toward Hannah's voice. She remarked that dismissal had not corrected Mrs. Mercer's appetite for other people's sorrow. Hannah felt the insult. She refused to display the wound. Celia asked Jonathan to decide. The house went quiet around him. He looked at his mother-in-law. He looked at Ruth. Then he looked past them toward the stairs, as if Matthew might offer a childhood in which to hide. He said the reception was the wrong occasion. Celia agreed. She asked when she should return. Jonathan hesitated. Cornelia answered for him. Never. Ruth finally spoke. She asked whether one cylinder was addressed to her. Cornelia said the matter had been settled. Ruth asked Celia the same question. Celia told her that every cylinder in the case contained something her mother wanted her family to hear. One additional recording, already in the house, had been made especially for her 17th birthday. Ruth turned to her grandmother. Cornelia's mouth became a narrow line. She said Lydia had not been herself. Celia replied that illness had weakened Lydia's body, not her knowledge of her children. The sentence moved through the passage like a door opening. Jonathan stepped forward. He asked Celia to leave the case with him. Cornelia said no. For the first time, he did not lower his eyes. He repeated the request. Celia held the case close. She had promised delivery, not surrender to another locked drawer. She would return the following morning after the reception. The family could listen in private. If Ruth refused, Celia would take the cylinders away. Ruth said she did not refuse. Cornelia released her arm. The girl stood alone. Hannah expected a confrontation. Instead, Cornelia turned with perfect calm and asked Mrs. Doyle why flowers had not yet been placed in the front parlor. The household moved again because Cornelia had commanded it to move. Hannah and Celia left by the rear door. On the street, Celia asked whether they had failed. Hannah looked back at the dark house. In an upstairs window, Matthew's face appeared behind the glass. A second face joined him. Ruth. Hannah said the silence had cracked. She did not yet know what would emerge. Ruth's birthday reception began at 7 the next evening. Carriages lined the snowy curb, electric lamps shone in the front rooms, brighter and less forgiving than gas. The rugs had been beaten, the silver polished, and every missing portrait disguised by greenery. A quartet played beneath the stairs. Cornelia had arranged the evening around an announcement to be made at 9. Philip Gage arrived with white roses and a narrow velvet box. He greeted Ruth by kissing her gloved hand. Then he asked whether she had slept. The question sounded tender until he added that shadows beneath the eyes made a woman appear willful. Ruth thanked him for the warning. She wore ivory silk chosen by her grandmother. At her throat was Lydia's pearl pendant, though Cornelia had called it a Wycliffe heirloom and never spoken the former owner's name. Throughout the first hour, Ruth accepted congratulations for a birthday that felt like a legal proceeding. Guests admired the flowers, the house, and the prospect of closer ties between the Gage Bank and the Wycliffe Works. No announcement had yet been made, but everyone knew. Matthew was required to greet arrivals beside his father. Each time a guest asked his age or school, his stammer tightened. Philip corrected him twice by finishing the sentence. Jonathan finally sent the boy upstairs. Matthew did not go. He slipped through the servants' passage, put on his coat, and left by the kitchen door. No one noticed except Mrs. Doyle. She waited 10 minutes before telling Jonathan. By then, Matthew was halfway down the hill. Hannah was preparing for bed when someone pounded on Mrs. Rosen's shop door. She heard the bolt drawn below, Mrs. Rosen's alarmed voice, and a boy trying to speak faster than breath allowed. Matthew stood in the shop surrounded by hat forms, his hair wet with snow. His shoes were soaked. He had fallen on the ice and torn one knee of his trousers. He carried two things inside his coat: the cylinder he had recorded for Ruth and the one Cornelia had locked in her desk. Hannah stared at the second cylinder's label. For Ruth, when she is 17. Matthew said his father had taken the key after Celia left. He opened the drawer but did not remove the recording. At 6, Cornelia demanded the key back. Jonathan surrendered it. Matthew stole it from the chain at her waist while pretending to kiss her good evening. He expected Hannah to praise him. She did not. She said theft could not become honorable merely because the owner had done wrong. Matthew's face crumpled. He insisted the cylinder did not belong to Cornelia. Hannah knew he was right. She also knew a child should not have been forced to make that judgment because every adult had failed. She wrapped him in a blanket and asked why he had come. He said Ruth was going to promise herself to Philip. If she heard their mother first, she might remember she had a choice. Hannah asked whether Lydia's voice should decide whom Ruth married. Matthew shook his head. Ruth should decide. That was the point. Celia came downstairs from the room Mrs. Rosen had lent her. When she saw the stolen cylinder, she closed her eyes. Then she told Matthew that Lydia had worried most about Ruth learning to call obedience love. She had not known Cornelia planned a particular marriage. She had known only how easily a family could train a daughter to disappear while still standing before them.
Mrs. Rosen said they could debate morality after returning a freezing child to his father. She put on her coat. Hannah told her to stay. The shop could not be left unattended, and the Wycliffe reception did not need 4 uninvited women arriving with a runaway boy. Mrs. Rosen answered that 3 uninvited women were respectable if they carried a hatbox. She placed the blue cylinder case inside her largest hat carton. Celia took the 2 separate cylinders. Hannah took Matthew's cold hand. They hired a cab. The horse struggled up the icy grade while the city bells struck 8:30. At Wycliffe House, Philip Gage had begun his speech. He stood near the fireplace with a champagne glass. Ruth stood beside him. Cornelia sat in her carved chair, the velvet box with the engagement ring resting on her lap. Philip spoke of family continuance, shared interests, and the honor of joining 2 names associated with Cincinnati's progress. He spoke longer about names than about Ruth. Jonathan remained near the door. He had learned Matthew was missing, but Cornelia refused to alarm the guests. Mrs. Doyle had sent a footman toward the school and another toward Vine Street. When the front door opened, every head in the parlor turned. Matthew entered first, pale and wet. Jonathan crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled him close. Relief stripped years from his face. Then he saw Hannah, Celia, and Mrs. Rosen. The room began to murmur. Cornelia rose. Philip set down his glass. He asked what had happened. Matthew tried to answer. The crowd made his stammer worse. Philip told him to breathe and begin properly. Ruth left Philip's side. She went to her brother. Matthew took out the cylinder he had made. He told her it was the gift she had refused. The phrase broke across several attempts, but this time no one finished it for him. Ruth removed her gloves. She accepted the cylinder with both hands. Then Matthew gave her the recording from Lydia. Cornelia ordered her to put it down. Ruth looked at the label. Her lips moved over the words. For Ruth, when she is 17. Around her, guests shifted with the avid discomfort of people who wished to witness scandal without appearing curious. Mrs. Devereux whispered to Mrs. Gage. The banker's wife drew nearer to Philip. Hannah stepped forward. She said the family matter should continue in private. Cornelia replied that Mrs. Mercer had lost the right to advise privacy when she arrived at a respectable gathering with a former nurse and a runaway child. Mrs. Rosen lifted the hatbox. She said there was also a milliner. A few guests laughed before realizing Cornelia had not. Philip approached Ruth. He spoke softly, but the room was so still that everyone heard. He said grief could make ordinary objects seem more important than they were. Whatever the cylinder contained, Ruth should not allow hired people to use it against her family. Hannah saw Ruth flinch at the word hired. Philip reached for the cylinder. Ruth stepped back. He reminded her that they were about to announce an engagement. Ruth said no announcement had yet been made. The velvet ring box snapped shut in Cornelia's hand. She told Jonathan to remove Matthew and escort the 3 women out. Jonathan looked at his son. He looked at Lydia's handwriting. Then he crossed the room to the phonograph. It had been brought down from the attic that morning because the quartet's violinist wanted to compare a new commercial recording during rehearsal. The linen cover remained folded nearby. Jonathan set the machine on a side table and opened the cabinet for the reproducer. Cornelia called his name. He stopped. For one terrible second, Hannah thought he would obey again. Then Jonathan said that Cornelia had spoken his name for 4 years whenever she wanted Lydia silenced. He wound the machine. Guests began leaving. Some moved slowly, hoping to hear the recording from the hall. Mrs. Devereux did not move at all until Mrs. Rosen opened the parlor door and held it with unmistakable purpose.
Philip's parents protested that their family had been placed in an intolerable position. Ruth looked at Philip. She asked him to wait in the hall. He said he would remain beside his future wife. Ruth answered that he had just heard her say there was no engagement. For the first time that evening, she sounded like herself. Philip's face hardened. He said Cornelia had warned him that Lydia's instability might appear in the daughter. Jonathan moved toward him. Ruth raised one hand. She did not need defending from a sentence that had just told her everything she needed to know. Philip left with his parents. Only the family, the servants, Hannah, Celia, Mrs. Rosen, and Mrs. Devereux remained. The civic lady seemed rooted to her chair by equal parts concern and appetite. Cornelia turned her smoked spectacles toward her. Mrs. Devereux finally understood. She gathered her fur wrap and departed. Mrs. Rosen closed the door. The house was quiet again. But it was no longer Cornelia's quiet. Ruth placed Matthew's cylinder on the machine first. No one had expected that choice. Matthew stood beside Hannah, shivering despite the fire. Jonathan wrapped his own evening coat around the boy's shoulders. The cylinder began to turn. At first, there was only surface hiss. Then Matthew's recorded voice entered the room. It stammered. Every hesitation was preserved. Every breath remained. The machine did not conceal what Cornelia called a defect. It also did not show shame. The recorded boy thanked Ruth for sitting outside his door during thunderstorms. He remembered her inventing stories about lightning. He said he knew she stayed even when she pretended she had merely been passing. Ruth pressed one hand against her mouth. The voice reached the final line. It said she had always heard what he meant. When the cylinder ended, Ruth crossed the space between them and embraced her brother. She apologized aloud, not in a whisper, not in a corner, not with explanations about a hand pressing her wrist. She named what she had done. She said she had used the cruelest thing she knew because she was afraid to displease their grandmother. She did not ask Matthew to tell her it was nothing. Matthew's arms closed around her. Cornelia sat motionless. Hannah thought the old woman looked smaller without a room full of people to obey her. Ruth released her brother and lifted Lydia's cylinder. Celia examined it under the lamp. The wax had survived the journey and Matthew's escape, but one edge was chipped. She adjusted the reproducer to reduce pressure. Hannah steadied the horn. Jonathan asked Ruth whether she was certain. Ruth said she had spent 4 years being certain of things other people chose for her. She wanted, for once, to learn what uncertainty contained. Celia set the stylus down. The cylinder turned. There was a breath. Then Lydia Bell spoke into the parlor. Her voice was lower than Hannah expected. Illness had roughened it, but warmth lived beneath the weakness. She began with a birthday greeting. She said she hoped Ruth had inherited Jonathan's patience and none of Cornelia's talent for arranging other people's chairs. Jonathan gave a broken laugh. Cornelia gripped her cane. Lydia said she did not know what story her daughter had been told. That was why she had asked Celia to preserve the message until Ruth was old enough to hear pain without being made responsible for it. She had not chosen to leave her children. The physicians told her that remaining near them might endanger Matthew. Jonathan believed the mountain air could return her to them. Cornelia promised that the children would receive every word. Lydia had agreed because a mother could be persuaded to walk into exile if the road was called protection. The machine hissed. For several rotations, her breathing was the only sound. Ruth reached for Matthew's hand. Lydia continued. She had written each week. When no answers came, Cornelia explained that Ruth was calmer without the letters, and that Matthew's stammer worsened whenever his mother was mentioned. Lydia began to fear that her love itself had become a burden. She said she did not blame the children for silence. She did not even ask them to blame Cornelia. But she wanted Ruth to know that love without truth could become another name for possession.
Then came the only sentence spoken with force. "Do not vanish to keep a family comfortable." The recording weakened after that. Lydia described a red scarf Ruth had once worn while stealing pears from a neighbor's tree. She remembered Matthew asleep with one shoe on. She asked Jonathan to tell the children about the summer they lived in 2 rented rooms and were happier than they had ever been in Cornelia's large house. At the end, she said each name: Jonathan, Ruth, Matthew. No one moved until the stylus reached the blank groove and began clicking softly. Hannah lifted it. The room returned. Ruth remained beside the phonograph. Tears stood on her face, but she was not sobbing. Her grief looked too large for noise. She asked Cornelia how many letters had come. Cornelia said this was not the hour. Ruth asked again. Jonathan turned toward the desk. Cornelia told him to leave it closed. He took the brass key from the chain still hanging at her waist. She did not stop him. The bottom drawer contained the birthday letter, 3 packets tied with green ribbon, and a small book in Lydia's hand. The ribbon was the same shade as the bundle Hannah had seen on her first afternoon in the house. Cornelia had kept the letters beside her chair for years. Jonathan placed them on the table. The top packet was addressed to Ruth, the second to Matthew, the third to him. Most had never been opened. Ruth touched the stack intended for her. There were birthdays, Christmases, ordinary Tuesdays, and days without any date at all. 4 years of childhood waited beneath green ribbon. She asked why. Cornelia removed her spectacles. Without them, her blind eyes looked defenseless and terrible. She said Lydia had always known how to make feeling appear more righteous than duty. Even as a girl, she could enter a room in tears and cause everyone to forget the harm her disobedience had done. In Colorado, she accused, she begged, she made impossible promises. The children were becoming ill from longing. Ruth said the letters were unopened. Cornelia could not know what they contained. The old woman's mouth trembled. She had opened the first ones. That had been enough. Jonathan asked about the cylinders burned in the furnace. Cornelia turned toward Mrs. Doyle. The housekeeper did not lower her eyes. Cornelia admitted there had been 2 cases. Matthew made a sound as if struck. Hannah moved toward him, but Ruth reached him first. Cornelia insisted that she had acted from fear. She had lost an infant son to scarlet fever before Lydia was born. She remembered the red notice nailed to the front door, neighbors crossing the street, and a small coffin taken away while she stood behind quarantine glass. When Lydia began coughing blood, Cornelia saw disease moving toward Matthew. She would not allow one child's longing to carry another child into a grave. Sending Lydia west had not been enough. Lydia remained in the house through every letter, every recording, every question. Cornelia believed the family could survive only if the door closed completely. Celia said Lydia was not a disease. Cornelia replied that the nurse had seen her at the end, when affection cost nothing but words. Cornelia had been left with bills, frightened children, a failing works, and a son-in-law who could not decide whether to grieve or fight. Jonathan bowed his head. Ruth did not. She told Cornelia that hardship had given her power, not innocence. The sentence seemed to age the old woman more than blindness had. Cornelia reached for Ruth's hand. Ruth stepped beyond reach. No one in the room pretended not to see. They listened to no more cylinders that night. Grief had entered the room, but it did not behave like the cleansing storm promised in sentimental novels. It did not make everyone kinder. It did not arrange guilt according to who had suffered most. It left them tired, angry, and unable to return to the people they had been before 9 o'clock. Ruth carried her mother's letters upstairs. Matthew took his recording and followed. Jonathan placed Lydia's birthday cylinder in the blue case Celia had brought. He locked neither the case nor the cabinet. Cornelia remained beside the fire. She asked Hannah to read the birthday letter aloud. Hannah said no. The refusal shocked Cornelia more than any accusation. Hannah explained that the letter belonged to Ruth. If Ruth later chose to share it, that would be her gift, not Cornelia's right. The old woman reached for her bell. Her hand stopped before touching it. For perhaps the first time in 20 years, she understood that ringing could summon a servant, but not restore authority. Celia asked for a room at a nearby hotel. Jonathan offered the guest chamber. She declined. She had slept under Cornelia's roof once, during Lydia's final visit to Cincinnati before the illness was diagnosed. She did not wish to do it again. Mrs. Rosen announced that her upstairs room had held worse company than a nurse with a box of ghosts. They prepared to leave. At the door, Jonathan asked Hannah to wait. He wanted her to return the next morning. Not as Cornelia's employee. He did not know in what capacity. He only knew the children trusted her, and the household would need help. Hannah looked through the hall toward the stairs. She cared for Matthew. She had begun to care for Ruth. She even felt something for Jonathan, though it was not the rescuing tenderness that lonely people sometimes mistook for love. It was recognition. He had survived by yielding until yielding became his character. If she returned to make decisions for him, she would only become a gentler Cornelia. Hannah told him the children needed their father to help them now. He said he was afraid he would do it badly. She answered that badly and honestly would be an improvement. Then she left. The city knew by noon. No newspaper printed the story, but scandal traveled faster through churches and drawing rooms than type through a press. Guests repeated what they had seen in the parlor. Each retelling added something. Lydia had been hidden in an asylum. Cornelia had destroyed a will. Ruth had fled with a phonograph salesman. Matthew had accused Philip Gage of murder. Only the essential truth remained difficult to repeat. A family had allowed a powerful woman to erase a mother because resisting her would have cost comfort, money, and position. Mrs. Gage withdrew the bank's informal promise to extend credit to the works. Philip sent Ruth a letter describing the engagement as postponed until calm returned. The wording allowed him to appear patient without risking himself. Ruth sent the velvet ring box back unopened. She included one sentence: there had been no engagement to postpone. Cornelia did not speak to her for 3 days. This punishment had once governed the house. Now Ruth used the silence to read. She began with the earliest letter. Lydia wrote about the journey west, the vastness of the plains, and her shame at feeling wonder while leaving her children behind. She asked whether Ruth's front tooth had grown straight. She reminded Matthew not to hide beetles in his pockets. She told Jonathan that the mountains were beautiful enough to make a person furious. In later letters, hope thinned. Lydia asked why Ruth no longer wrote. She feared her daughter had been told that illness was a form of abandonment. She begged Jonathan not to let Cornelia turn protection into forgetting. Ruth read until dawn. Some letters made her weep. Others made her angry with Lydia. Her mother could be demanding, bitter, and unfair. She accused Jonathan of cowardice, then apologized on the next page. She promised to recover long after the physicians had stopped promising. The letters did not reveal a saint. They revealed a woman. That mattered more. Matthew could not read his packet alone. He carried it to Jonathan. Father and son sat in the old schoolroom where Matthew had hidden after Hannah's dismissal. Jonathan read slowly. When his voice failed, Matthew waited. Neither completed the other's sentences. Lydia's letters to the boy were simpler than those to Ruth. She described birds outside the sanatorium window. She invented adventures for a wooden horse he had left in her trunk. In one letter, she wrote only that she had dreamed of buttoning his coat. Jonathan stopped there. Matthew asked whether his mother had truly wanted to come home. Jonathan said yes. The boy asked why his father had not brought her. Jonathan did not blame money, medicine, or Cornelia.
He said he had been afraid of Lydia dying in front of the children, afraid of Matthew becoming ill, afraid of losing the works, and afraid of opposing the woman who paid for everything. Then he said the harder thing. He had chosen what he feared least. Matthew considered this. He asked whether adults always did that. Jonathan said too often. By the end of the week, Matthew's stammer had not vanished, but his father had learned to wait through it, and a child's voice changes when it no longer has to race another person's impatience. Cornelia's blindness deepened after the reception. Perhaps it had already been worsening, and pride had concealed it. Perhaps the strain of those days made every shadow feel permanent. She began misjudging doorways. Twice she spilled tea. Once she called Ruth by Lydia's name and then denied it. Hannah returned to the house only when Mrs. Doyle sent word that Cornelia had fallen near the stairs. She found the old woman in the library with a bruise along one cheek. Jonathan had called an eye surgeon. An operation might restore some sight, but Cornelia refused to discuss it. She wanted Hannah to resume reading. Hannah asked whether this was an offer of employment or an order. Cornelia said she would pay double. Hannah replied that money did not answer the question. The widow turned her face toward the cold fireplace. Without visitors and servants positioned around her, she looked like an old woman trapped inside a house designed for someone stronger. She said she did not know how to ask. It was the first admission Hannah had ever heard from her. Hannah sat down. She did not open the newspaper. Cornelia asked what Lydia had said in the letters. Hannah reminded her that the letters belonged to the children. The old woman's impatience returned. She said Ruth refused to read them aloud, though surely a grandmother had some claim to understand a daughter's final thoughts. Hannah answered that Cornelia had owned the unopened letters for 4 years. Possession had not become understanding. Cornelia's hands tightened in her skirt. After a while, she asked Hannah to read from the book of Job. Hannah chose another book. It was a volume of poems by Christina Rossetti. Cornelia objected that poetry encouraged self-pity. Hannah read anyway. She stayed for 1 hour. At the end, Cornelia asked whether she would come again. Hannah said she would come on Thursday, if invited. The word invited caused Cornelia visible effort. At last, she said, "Please come on Thursday." Hannah did. Their new arrangement had no written terms. Cornelia paid the same wage as before, not double. Hannah came 3 afternoons a week and returned to her room above the millinery shop each evening. She read what she chose from a list they made together. She did not answer Cornelia's bell. She did not report on Ruth or Matthew. Sometimes Cornelia insulted her, and Hannah left early. Sometimes the old woman listened. Change, Hannah discovered, was less like a door opening than like a stiff hinge moved a fraction each day. Jonathan decided to leave Wycliffe House in February. The decision threatened the works, the children's inheritance, and every comfort they had known. It also came 4 years too late. He rented a narrow brick house in Clifton near the streetcar line. It had 6 rooms, a leaking roof, and a pear tree in the backyard. Ruth's bedroom overlooked an alley. Matthew would have to carry coal from the shed. They loved it at once. Cornelia called the house an act of ingratitude. Jonathan said it was an address. She warned that the Gage Bank might force the works into receivership if he separated the family. He replied that the family had already been separated inside her house. Cornelia told him he had never possessed the strength to direct Lydia and did not possess the strength to direct her children. Jonathan said he no longer intended to direct them, as if love were another drafting instrument. His voice shook. He still said it. The move took place on a raw March morning. Ruth packed Lydia's letters, the blue cylinder cases, and the pearl pendant. Matthew carried the phonograph to the hired wagon with Jonathan.
Cornelia watched from the library window, though she could see only moving shapes. Mrs. Doyle wept openly. Hannah helped wrap dishes in newspaper. The task reminded her of moving after Samuel's death, when every plate had seemed to contain evidence of meals they would never share again. This time the paper held advertisements for spring hats and factory auctions. The future and the past folded around each other. Ruth came downstairs with the last box. Cornelia stood in the hall. She told Ruth that leaving would expose the family to gossip and reduce her prospects. Ruth said staying had nearly reduced her to someone else. Cornelia asked whether Lydia's voice had taught her to despise the grandmother who raised her. Ruth's face changed. For weeks, anger had made the choices simple. Cornelia was guilty. Lydia had been wronged. Jonathan had failed. Ruth had suffered. But love had not disappeared merely because the truth arrived. Cornelia had sat beside Ruth through scarlet fever. She had taught her to read music, pinned every school ribbon, and waited outside the dentist's office while pretending not to worry. She had also taught her to humiliate a working woman and call fear duty. Both histories were true. Ruth said she did not despise her. Cornelia reached for that answer like a reprieve. Ruth continued. She could love her grandmother and still refuse to become her. Cornelia's hand fell. Ruth kissed her cheek. Then she carried the box outside. The old woman did not ask anyone to stay. The Wycliffe works survived, though not in the way Cornelia had planned. Jonathan negotiated directly with 3 senior foremen and a supplier in Dayton. They reduced production for a season, sold an unused warehouse, and accepted smaller contracts. The Gage Bank tightened its terms but did not foreclose. Banks preferred profit to wounded pride. The family name ceased to be the company's only support. At home, money became less abstract. Ruth learned the price of coal. Matthew learned that shoes left near a leaking window froze stiff. Jonathan learned to leave the works before dark twice each week because no servant waited to notice whether his children had eaten. They made mistakes. Ruth burned a pot of oatmeal and declared domestic life a conspiracy against women. Matthew broke a lamp. Jonathan forgot to pay the gas bill, and the house went dark for one evening. They sat beneath blankets while the phonograph's spring wound down. In the darkness, Matthew imitated Philip Gage finishing other people's sentences. Ruth laughed so suddenly that she frightened herself. Jonathan laughed next. It was not the return of the family they had been before Lydia left. That family was gone. It was something less polished and more deliberate. Hannah visited on Sundays, though never at a fixed hour. She helped Ruth sort the cylinders by date and copy their labels onto clean cards. She showed Matthew how to shave an old practice cylinder smooth so it could be used again. They did not play Lydia's voice every time. At first, Matthew wanted to. Ruth refused. She feared memory would become another command, telling them how to feel and who to be. Celia, before returning west, had taught them how to store the wax away from heat and damp. She said preservation was not the same as worship. That distinction became important. They listened when they chose. Sometimes a cylinder contained nothing profound. Lydia recited a ridiculous poem. She complained about sanatorium porridge. She recorded wind against the window and insisted the children imagine the mountains. Those ordinary moments healed more than the final message. They released Lydia from the single role of tragic mother. She could be impatient, amused, vain, frightened, and alive. One Sunday, Ruth played the cylinder marked, "For Jonathan." Her father asked her not to. She gave him the same choice he had finally given her. It could remain unheard as long as he wished. He waited 3 weeks. Then he listened alone. No one asked afterward what Lydia had said. The next morning, he took their wedding photograph from the bottom of his trunk and hung it in the front room of the small house. He did not turn it toward the wall.
Ruth did not marry Philip Gage. By summer, his engagement to a judge's daughter appeared in the society pages. Cornelia sent the clipping without comment. Ruth used the blank margin for a grocery list. She also left the girls' academy. This decision caused a new quarrel. Cornelia wanted her to finish the social curriculum and spend a season with relatives in Boston. Jonathan worried that leaving would narrow her choices. Ruth replied that her choices had been narrow because everyone kept describing them as doors. With Celia's encouragement, she applied to a hospital training school for nurses. She was too young for full admission, so she began as a volunteer reader in a children's ward and took science lessons in the evening. The first time she entered a room marked for infectious illness, she froze. She saw Cornelia's red quarantine notice. She saw Lydia boarding a westbound train. She saw fear dressed as duty. Then a little girl inside asked for a story. Ruth washed her hands, tied on the required apron, and entered. She did not imagine courage meant lack of fear. Matthew had taught her better. Matthew continued practicing his speech with Hannah. He never became fluent in the effortless way Cornelia had demanded. Some days he barely hesitated. Some days a single word required all his strength. At school, a teacher tried to excuse him from oral recitation. Matthew refused. He stood before the class and read a poem into the silence. The pauses belonged to him. No one took them away. When he finished, there was no miracle. A boy in the back row snickered. A girl near the window applauded. The teacher looked ashamed. Matthew sat down smiling. In September, Hannah was offered a partnership in a small phonograph and sheet music shop. The owner, Mr. Klein, had heard from Mrs. Rosen that Hannah could demonstrate machines without making customers feel ignorant. More important, she had an idea he believed might earn money. Many Cincinnati families had sons working in distant cities, daughters married across the country, or relatives who had remained in Europe. Letters carried words, but not the human voice. Commercial recording rooms existed, yet working people found them expensive and intimidating. Hannah proposed a private booth where customers could make short cylinders at a modest price. She would help those who could not read prepare a message. She would not correct accents or demand polished speech. Mr. Klein provided the machine and rear room. Hannah provided the labor. They called it the Family Voice Service. The name embarrassed her. It also filled the appointment book. The German baker recorded a Christmas song for his mother in Bremen. A factory girl sent her younger sisters a message describing her first wages. An elderly man spent 20 minutes unable to speak into the horn, then recorded only his daughter's name. Hannah wrapped each cylinder in cotton and reminded customers not to store wax near a stove. She never promised the machines could defeat death. She said only that a voice could cross a distance if someone chose to send it, and someone else chose to listen. One October afternoon, Cornelia Wycliffe arrived at the shop. Mrs. Doyle guided her through the door. The eye operation had restored a little vision in the right eye. She could distinguish the brass horns shining beneath the electric lights. She could also distinguish Hannah's shape behind the counter. Cornelia carried no cane. She asked to make a recording. Hannah led her to the rear booth. Before the horn, Cornelia became uncertain. She had spent a lifetime speaking as if every room were required to remember her. The machine's blank cylinder seemed to ask what deserved preservation. She said she wanted to address Ruth. Hannah placed the recording attachment but did not lower it. She asked whether Cornelia intended the cylinder to replace an apology in person. The old woman said Ruth would not remain alone with her long enough. Hannah replied that a recording should not be used to enter a room from which conduct had excluded her. Cornelia's old anger flashed. She accused Hannah of moral pride. Hannah agreed it was possible. Then she waited. Cornelia sat down. She admitted that she did not know how to apologize without explaining why she had been right to be afraid. Hannah said fear was part of the truth. It was not the whole truth.
Cornelia asked what the whole truth was. Hannah could not give it to her. Lydia was dead. Ruth was wounded. Jonathan had his own guilt. Matthew had lost years of his mother's voice. There was no sentence large enough to make those accounts balance. At last, Cornelia asked whether the machine could be used for practice and the cylinder shaved afterward. Hannah said yes. The old woman made 7 recordings. In the first, she blamed the physicians. In the second, she blamed Jonathan. In the third, she described the infant son she had lost and the red quarantine notice. In the fourth, she told Ruth how much she had sacrificed. In the fifth, she wept and could not continue. In the sixth, she said Lydia's name. In the seventh, she spoke for less than 1 minute. When it ended, Cornelia asked Hannah to replay it. Her recorded voice filled the small booth. It sounded older than she expected. She had said that she loved Ruth, that she had used love to excuse control, and that she had stolen from Lydia something no mother had the right to take. She did not ask Ruth to forgive her. She asked only for the chance to listen if Ruth ever wished to speak. Cornelia sat very still. Then she said the recording was insufficient. Hannah agreed. Cornelia took the cylinder with her anyway. Ruth did not play it for 2 weeks. When she finally did, she listened once and placed it back in the case. She did not return to Wycliffe House that day. But on the following Thursday, she accompanied Hannah for the afternoon reading. Cornelia waited in the library. The green ribbons from Lydia's letters lay on the table. She had no right to the letters, so Ruth had given her only the ribbons. For several minutes, grandmother and granddaughter spoke about the weather. Then Cornelia asked whether Ruth was eating enough at the hospital. The old habit of command entered her voice. Ruth stood to leave. Cornelia stopped herself. She asked again, this time as a question. Ruth sat down. They did not reconcile that afternoon. They began. Some weeks Ruth stayed an hour. Some weeks she did not visit. Cornelia apologized, then defended herself, then apologized for the defense. Ruth sometimes used the old woman's guilt as a weapon. Jonathan came once and left after 10 minutes. Matthew refused to enter the house until spring. No one called this failure. For that family, honesty without immediate comfort was a new form of love. A year after Hannah first heard Lydia's broken message, the Bells gathered in the small Clifton house. Celia had returned from Colorado for a medical conference. Mrs. Rosen brought a hat for Ruth and pretended surprise when supper was offered. Mrs. Doyle came on her evening off. Cornelia arrived last in a hired carriage. The occasion was Matthew's 12th birthday. There were no society guests. No announcement had been prepared. The pear tree outside had lost its leaves, and wind pressed cold rain against the windows. After the dishes were cleared, Matthew placed a blank cylinder on the phonograph. He wanted to record the family. Jonathan objected that they had nothing planned. Matthew said that was why it might be true. They spoke one at a time. Mrs. Rosen advertised her shop until everyone protested. Mrs. Doyle recited the first lines of an Irish song. Celia sent a greeting to friends in Colorado. Ruth described the hospital ward and admitted she still burned oatmeal. Jonathan told the story of Matthew hiding beetles in his pockets. Cornelia sat beyond the horn. When her turn came, she said she had nothing suitable. No one forced her. The cylinder continued turning. In the last seconds, Cornelia leaned toward the horn. She said, Lydia would have laughed at all of them for trying so hard. Then the wax ran out. The room became quiet. Not the old quiet. This one contained rain, breathing, the settling stove, and Matthew winding the machine to play their voices back. Hannah listened from the edge of the group. She had not repaired the Wycliffe family. Families were not machines, and love was not a spring that one skilled hand could wind.
Lydia's voice had not repaired them either. It had broken the story that kept them obedient. After that, each person had chosen what to do with the pieces. Matthew heard his recorded voice reach the room. It still carried pauses. Ruth's laughter followed. Jonathan's story, Mrs. Doyle's song, Celia's greeting, and Cornelia saying her daughter's name all emerged from the brass horn. When the cylinder ended, Ruth looked toward Hannah. She said there was one voice missing. Hannah had spent years helping other people speak into machines. She had told herself that the person tending the instrument did not belong in the recording. It was an old mistake. Matthew placed a fresh cylinder on the mandrel. Hannah leaned toward the horn. She did not deliver a speech. She did not explain how she had entered the house as a paid reader and left carrying the weight of its secrets. She did not say that they had become her family. The word was too easy when spoken before the harder acts that gave it meaning. She said her name. Then she said she was there. The cylinder turned beneath the stylus, cutting her voice into wax. Around her, no one looked away.